Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing censorship, left, right, and center. I'm Pat Zerke. For 37 years, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you live public discussions of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. Liberals react with outrage when anti-war protesters are confined to small protest zones at presidential appearances. Yet these same liberals are likely to support college speech codes that similarly repress controversial speech. Is any amount of censorship too much? How has our understanding of inflammatory rhetoric changed over time? With us are Wendy Kaminer and Harvey Silverglate, and their guests, Jeremy McKean and Dan Tapia, both of whom have been targeted by censors from the left and the right. Together they will discuss incivility, free speech, and repressing dissent in the war on terror. This discussion is actually a rehearsal for the talk and call-in radio program that Wendy and Harvey are developing. Tentatively entitled On Liberty, the program will explore the role and importance of civil liberties in contemporary society by speaking with participants from actual civil liberties cases, controversies, and battles. So this is a dry run. Wendy Kaminer is an attorney, social critic, contrarian, and the author of 7 books, including I'm Dysfunctional, You're Dysfunctional, Sleeping with Extraterrestrials, and most recently, Free for All, Defending Liberty in America Today, just out from Beacon Press. Wendy is an alum of Cambridge Forum. This is at least her 3rd appearance here. So welcome back to Cambridge Forum, Wendy Kaminer.
Thank you. I know it is always dangerous to speak for Harvey, but I think I can say on behalf of both of us that we're very pleased to be here talking about censorship at the Cambridge Forum, because the Cambridge Forum is devoted to free speech. This is a free speech zone, which means that all of us should feel free to offend, intimidate, or discomfort each other with our remarks. Now, we all hope that we will be civil about this, but civility is preferred, not required, by a commitment to free speech. I want to stress this at the outset because in recent years, our notions of free speech have been limited by a very strong ethic of inoffensiveness. Now, most people don't want to be called censors, so you often hear people say things like, well, I'm not a censor, but I don't believe in censorship, but free speech doesn't mean you have a right to offend people, to scare people, to make people uncomfortable, to make racist or sexist remarks. And all I can say is, I don't believe in censorship, and I believe that free speech does give you the right to offend and to scare and to make people uncomfortable and even to make racist or sexist remarks. We don't need the First Amendment or any commitment to free expression to protect speech that's popular or respectful. We need it to protect the speech that is unpopular and disrespectful and offensive and even sometimes hateful. I remember when feminists first started talking about sexual harassment, including various forms of verbal abuse or even sort of sexual incivility, and I would hear students explain to me that harassment is making someone feel uncomfortable. And my response was always, well, in my work, I strive to make at least a few people uncomfortable every day. In fact, a day in which I don't say something that makes someone uncomfortable is, from my perspective, a day in which I've said nothing. How did we get here? I mean, I think in part this very limited notion of free speech derives from the therapeutic culture with its emphasis on everyone's psychic fragility. This notion that words have such power that they can wound people, they abuse people, they can even traumatize people. And you hear this being picked up by people on the left and right. One of the arguments sometimes made for a constitutional amendment banning the desecration of the flag is that burning a flag simply offends too many people. It upsets too many people. The therapeutic culture also helped erase the distinction between words and actions, and you hear this a lot in the feminist fight against pornography. You hear feminists say that pornography doesn't simply encourage rape, an arguable proposition, but that pornography is rape. You'll see this kind of thinking reflected in one of the cases we're discussing tonight, which involves the reaction to some posters put up by a Harvard pro-life group that depicted a rape victim. And some students said that this re-victimized women who had been actually raped. Now, at the risk of offending somebody, I have to say that to equate the experience of being raped with the experience of looking at a poster is, to use a term of arts, a bit nuts. But this notion that there's virtually no difference between verbal assaults and actual assaults has become fairly common. And again, I think it comes a lot from the therapeutic culture. But censorship, as we know, is a lot older than therapy. It is a fact of life, or rather a fact of power. People who are in power often use their power to suppress whatever speech they don't like. For many years, for decades, we've associated censorship with the right because the right had a lot of power and they used it to target people on the left. But in recent years, the left has also embraced censorship in places where they tend to have acquired some power, notably on college campuses, and my colleague Harvey Silverglate, I think, will have much more to say about that.
Harvey Silverglate is a criminal defense and civil liberties lawyer. Over 35 years, he has represented demonstrators, pornographers, newspaper reporters, political dissidents, American Nazis, and many others in First Amendment cases. Active in the American Civil Liberties Union, Harvey also founded the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which seeks to restore lost liberty in higher education. Representing students in trouble has been a specialty of his from 1969, when he was called to defend the student protesters who took over Harvard's University Hall, to the present, when his book, co-authored with Alan Charles Kors, The Shadow University, The Betrayal of Liberty on American Campuses, has been issued in a new paperback edition from Harper Perennial. Welcome back to Cambridge Forum, Harvey Silverglate.
Thank you, Ben. I would reiterate what Wendy said. It's a pleasure to be here, one of the few remaining forums for pure free speech, unfettered expression. It's an honor to be here. We have intentionally today brought two people who have been censored from different ends of the political spectrum in order to make the point. It is true that in various sectors of society, the government or in the private sector, various times in history, censorship comes more from one end of the spectrum than from the other. But at any given time, you can be assured that there will be some censorship from either end of the spectrum. And we mean to illustrate that with two guests today, who one of whom is a teacher at a public high school, the other of whom is a student at a small local college. And these people have both been recently the victims of censorship. Dan Tapia, who is the class of Harvard, class of 05, is president of Harvard Right to Life. Now, the Right to Life position, anti-abortion position, is an unpopular one on most college campuses, and decidedly so at Harvard. And his group has taken an unpopular anti-abortion position. And they have had problems now. This is not the first year. Dan will tell you the details. Not the first year they've had the problem of their posters being ripped down. Now, technically, I suppose one could say that's not censorship because it isn't the university that's censoring. But this is at least the second year, maybe even more, that the group has had this problem. And the university has been decidedly slow in doing anything about it. So in a sense, we are talking about a form of censorship. It's a kind of a hidden form. That is, students go about censoring fellow students, and the university does nothing about it. Now, I can assure you that at Harvard, when there are incidents where the other side of the spectrum, that is to say, there was an incident just at the law school last year, an incident involving racist speech. The student who dared to utter something that was considered racially offensive was immediately proceeded against. There were all kinds of meetings. There was a proposal that there be a new speech code drafted at Harvard Law School to cover these situations, on and on. So you do find that there is a double standard at the university, and that Dan's group, Harvard Right to Life, is a victim of that double standard. Nat Hentoff, the great civil libertarian columnist for the Village Voice and other publications, likes to say that censorship is the most powerful human urge. Sex, he says, is a distant second. And I think that there's much to be said for that. There's always somebody who, as the saying goes, likes to utter, "Shut up," he reasoned, and it's done all the time. We'll also get into the evolving nature of the censorship. The censorship today is less done with the red pen as it is done with the pressure to be correct. It's where the phrase political correctness comes from. The notion that you shouldn't say things that are slightly immoral because they're not politically acceptable positions. And universities particularly have adopted speech codes which outlaw on our university campuses speech that will offend members of any number of enumerated groups. Now, Jeremy McKean, who is a 12th grade teacher, was teaching at English High School in Lynn and was preparing to show his class the film Bowling for Columbine, which many of you have probably seen. It won an Academy Award last year. And it's, of course, a film from the left, critical of the gun culture and other aspects of sort of conservative American culture. The students were 17 and 18 years of age, and the showing of the film had been approved by the head of the English department, and all of a sudden the principal nixed it, saying that it was an inappropriate time and place to show such a film. And we will be asking Jeremy exactly what was meant by that. What was this film going to do to these students? And I think it will be enlightening to see the difference between the rationale, the justifications for the censorship from the right and the censorship from the left. So that's where we are going to go in the next hour and some minutes. Now, I think that rather than have me continue to talk, I'd like to ask Dan to give you a summary of what happened this year, and also, if you would, get into what happened last year, because I think it's very important that this is a repeat. The university or somebody is a recidivist here that has done this more than once. So why don't you just tell your story?
My name is Daniel Tapia. I'm a junior at Harvard College and the president of Harvard Right to Life. I think the best way to begin would to start with what transpired last year, because that set the stage for everything that took place this year. We began a poster campaign which depicted the different stages of the unborn baby's development with facts relating to that specific stage and pictures. As we went about this, we found that every poster within hours was torn down, and it turned into a truly epidemic problem. As we continued postering, we approached the dean of the college and asked her if there was anything that could be done to ensure free speech. And she responded, well, first of all, the dean said that really this is a student issue, something that should be resolved in the college, among the students, basically hanging us out to dry without any other alternative, any option. And one of the things that he had mentioned to us was that nothing could be done unless you caught someone in the act, someone tearing down a poster breaking free speech. as a side note, it's listed in the university handbook that to tear down an official student group's poster is what's called an ad-boardable offense. You're brought before the ad board.
And that's the disciplinary board at Harvard, right?
Right, the advisory board, which is the highest level office of disciplinary action that can be achieved. So within the code of the university that's listed, the dean of the college suggested that we try and find someone who is breaking the university rules and then try and proceed from there. Well, a few weeks later, I had posted some of the posters with approved as an approved student group with a date of expiration, and I had caught not only a student, which would be an interesting scenario, but a teaching fellow for the college tearing down some of the posters. And after asking her name for a while, I finally received her name and went to the dean to talk to her about it. And after being referred to a few different deans being passed around, I finally heard that she had a different story than what she had told me when I caught her tearing it down.
Now, let me ask you this. There was at least one student who confessed in the Harvard Crimson tearing down the posters. Is that correct?
Right. That's true.
Was that student prosecuted?
No.
Did anything happen to that student?
No, nothing.
And
that was this year.
Okay. And did your group do anything in order to try to get at least one student prosecuted for tearing down your posters?
We reported all the cases to the dean, and nothing had happened.
And did the dean explain why?
The dean has given us a number of different reasonings, from suggesting that we tell for example, the teaching fellow from last year that it's against the university rules to inform her of the rules, as if it's our responsibility to do that on an individual case-by-case basis.
Do you have any?
Can I ask you a question? My understanding, too, and I think this was reported in the Crimson, was that your group this year, after more incidents of posters being torn down and some complaints about this poster that depicted a rape victim, that your group agreed to submit your posters for preliminary review to Harvard's Office of Sexual Misconduct. I don't know exactly what it's called. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
We're talking about
Sure.
the Office of Sexual Assault Prevention and Response. Is that the office?
Right.
Yes.
One of the poster series that we had this year depicted women who had had an abortion and gave a testimonial why they regretted it, real testimonials and quotes from their specific case, one of which was from a woman who had been raped and regretted her abortion, saying that it didn't solve her problems and it only compounded the pain and grief brought about by the rape. And when this poster went up, some of the various members of the Harvard community, specifically from the Coalition Against Sexual Violence, had a meeting where we spoke with them, and they asked if we would be willing to submit our posters to the Office of Sexual Assault. And
submit them before you put them up, right?
right.
Now, was this for her approval or an advisory opinion on the posters?
Advisory.
And what were they looking for in the posters? Do you know the criteria by which they were going to judge whether the posters were okay?
If it was to their taste, I would assume.
And why did you agree to let them see your posters before you put them up?
Well, we have nothing to do with sexual assault. That's not our aim. This was just one particular poster that made a reference to it, and that was the only reason that theme was in any of the posters to begin with.
No, I should say that.
Do you feel it's appropriate? Did you feel that you were giving something up when you agreed to let this Office of Sexual Abuse Prevention look at your poster, or are you comfortable doing that?
I feel comfortable getting advice, especially from people who are well qualified.
Now, according to there was a letter written to the Harvard Crimson by the head of the Office of Sexual Assault prevention and response. And she said, well, we're not really censoring, we're just giving advice on whether or not, this is a quote, the posters are potentially offensive or re-traumatizing to survivors, close quote. Do you think it's by any stretch of the imagination your posters could be seen as, well, perhaps offensive, simply because someone who disagrees with your point of view might find it offensive, but in any way, do you think any of your posters could be seen as traumatizing to survivors or anyone else?
There's an obvious parallel between the poster that we put up and various posters for the Office of Sexual Assault, both of which did nothing more than mention rape. For theirs, one instance, last year, there was a poster by the Students for Choice, which had in the first person a woman, a line saying, it was she was raped, and here are your options: adoption, continue with the childbirth, abortion, or various other alternatives. And when that came about, when the Students for Choice had a poster which said she was raped, which obviously can conjure up the same images or recollections that any of our posters could bring about, nothing was done and didn't raise a stir whatsoever. The underlying reason why the poster got so much attention was because of the secondary theme of abortion, which was tied into it. And I believe that was the reason it raised so much attention.
I was interested, Dan, in your remark that when Harvey asked what criteria these administrators were going to use to review your proposals, you said, I don't know, I suppose just their taste. My guess is that you're essentially right. I think Jeremy had a similar experience running up against the taste of was it the superintendent or the principal of your high school when you showed your class bowling for Columbine. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. This
is Jeremy McKean.
Hi, I'm Jeremy. And I also teach 9th graders, 9 and 12. It wasn't the taste because no one had seen it. Every reporter I talked to, every superintendent, deputy, principal, teacher, no one had seen the film, and yet it was pulled from my classroom the second day I was showing it.
Did any of the students complain about it?
There are a few stories that they didn't tell me. I started showing it on a Wednesday. I showed it Wednesday and Thursday.
This is the film Bowling for Columbine, Michael Moore's film.
The Oscar-winning documentary, the only documentary to win at the Cannes Film Festival.
I guess winning the Academy Award doesn't inoculate you from everything. Huh?
No, well, I had given an extra credit paper to my seniors if they saw the hours or read the book, and they saw Bowling for Columbine to write a paper on it about a month before. I would just give them an extra test grade. Some of them did, and so we had a down week. It was the last week of the marking period. I brought in a film to show the kids. We had an extra long period. They could have their lunch. It was nice. We'd sit around, talk. Kid says, I got Bowling for Columbine. And he and I had a talk about it. He had written a great paper about it. And so I said, well, guys, you want to see my movie? You want to see Bowling for Columbine? And the kid said, let's see Bowling for Columbine. And half of them had already seen it, so they wanted to see it again. So quickly asked the department head. She came in, watched it with us. Every 5 or 6 minutes, I constantly commentate, which probably annoys my kids. But if you're showing something of that nature, you want to make sure that they know what they're seeing and understand why they're seeing what they're seeing, because it's a very heavy film. And so I was getting up and I was going through it. This scene is about this, and we talked about violence, we talked about guns. It was pretty nice. And all of a sudden, Jeremy, you can't show the film anymore.
Well, all of a sudden, was it the superintendent or the principal?
It was the principal.
And did he come into the classroom while you were showing the film?
No, I was told via another person. No one told. Somebody called the paper without talking to me. Apparently, a parent who never spoke their name. I heard it was a student complaint. Nobody ever gave me the straight story. But before I knew anything, before I finished showing the last hour of the film, the papers were on the phone wanting to interview. It made no sense whatsoever because I had taken every precaution with the film, as I do with any film I show them,
Now, my understanding from one of the press reports was that the principals objected to the film because Michael Moore, the filmmaker, was opposed to the war.
Yeah,
Is that right? And
it was the week after the Oscars. It's kind of funny because McNamara is down the street, and his movie just won, The Fog of War, and that's
Errol Morris's movie about
Errol Morris's
about
and
Robert
Errol
McNamara.
Morris's
Academy Award just
right.
this week, yeah.
So Errol Morris made comments at the Oscars, and last year Michael Moore made comments at the Oscar. And what I think happened is someone said, "Oh, they're showing Bowling for Columbine in this English classroom. I saw Michael Moore, and he wasn't happy with our president." And so,
So are you going to show Fog of War this year?
well, I'm laying low, obviously, at the Cambridge Forum. So the gist of it was that someone advised someone who advised the principal to advise my department head to advise me to stop showing the film because we were busy fighting in Iraq, and people felt that in a blue-collar town such as Lynn, with a large military population, that without seeing the movie, they knew everything about the movie, and somehow it was against war or against guns, or they didn't really know, but they didn't want it shown.
So I take it the theory here is that the more timely and relevant a movie is, the more dangerous it is to show. Is that the thinking here?
Well,
What did he say, the principal? According to the newspaper report, he said this isn't the time or
Right.
the place.
Right.
But when the time, what was he referring to? Was it the
we
war
had
in
just
Iraq?
invaded Iraq. Michael Moore had just won the Oscar.
And made a controversial
Made a
speech at the
controver- yeah.
Oscars.
And the place, was he talking about the fact that it was a school?
Maybe.
Or the fact that it was Lynn, perhaps.
Well, I mean, it's Bowling for Columbine is about Columbine High School,
Right.
guns, and we have at the
Yeah,
end of,
that's
there's
actually
more issues than just.
That's
it
interesting
comes out as
because
anti-war, but-
there has been so much rather hysterical censorship in high schools in the last few years in reaction to these awful shootings. I remember the ACLU had one case involving, I think, a junior high school kid who ended up in juvenile detention for a week or two because he said to another kid on the lunch line, "If you eat all those potatoes, I'm going to get you." That kind of thinking may have played into this. But I also remember reading that you were given the choice, having shown this film, you were given the choice of either transferring to another school or being fired. Is that right?
That came later, and that didn't come till August because I was told that I'd have my job for the next year, even given a schedule. And then the school I started at, I'm back there this year, and so that's up. I have my thoughts on that, but we'll see at the end of this year. I have 3 months and 1 day till tenure, so I don't want to.
Right.
I don't want to tie anything too tight, in case someone listens to NPR and Lynn. But
Well, we appreciate you coming here tonight.
I just would point out, one of the amazing things about the First Amendment cases in public schools is that contrary to what I think most of us, our instinct would be, the students actually have considerably more free speech rights than teachers because the courts have to some extent accepted as justification for censorship of teachers that there are academic standards, that the administration is allowed to have certain control over the curriculum, and within that broad category, there's an awful lot of viewpoint censorship, whereas students are not employees. They're the customers, if you can, Sears can control what its salespeople say, but not what its customers say.
Well, but Harvey, remember, we just had this case recently of a kid who, was he suspended? He was disciplined in some way for bringing a copy of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue to school. So I would hesitate to say that students, especially these days, have a lot of free speech.
I didn't say a lot, but I said
Well,
they're actually in a stronger position than the teachers, ironically.
I think that depends on who their parents are.
how much their parents have a pull in the school system.
Right. I mean, my recollection of high school is that every time a teacher got mad at me, they would threaten to call my parents. And I realized then that there were some kids who were afraid of their parents because they expected that to shut me out.
Unlike you.
At the time, I like to think that my parents were afraid of me, but I think that was probably not true. Before we open this up to the audience, I'd like to give Dan and Jeremy an opportunity to comment on each other's stories, if you have any comments to make. Do you see any similarities in what happened to each of you?
It's a lot to sink in after just hearing it. If you want to go.
Sure. I think it's great that you started out on Liberty and Cambridge Forum with abortion and guns, two of the most civil liberties bound issues. But and also that I'm a government employee. I teach for the city of Lynn. I teach for the people and the taxpayers of Lynn. And you go to Harvard, which, the private and public sector.
Which means nothing.
Which means everything.
Not when you're
I would
being
love to go to
censored.
Harvard. Yeah, I think it's terrible that they couldn't catch one person, and that we're in Cambridge. We're
it's not
across from
couldn't.
Harvard. I mean, it's
Didn't.
there's they didn't. They one dean and one student, correct? That was. If I was in charge, I would let your group do whatever they wanted. I mean, I think that you should let the public fight it out when it comes to these things. I think that if a law exists and you know that you're stepping over that law, it should either be followed or you should be civilly disobedient and go through with it. It definitely, I support what you do and I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't think that. I don't know. I think here. The people taking down your signs might be defended, and that worries me. That anyone don't hate anything except for hatred. People that are so busy pinpointing what to not or what to say and what not to say, and then they end up doing it to groups like yours that stand for things that you believe in just as strongly as the next person. And the fact that they put up a poster that said the same exact thing as yours in some context and a picture and a testimony as well.
I'd like to ask both of you a very brief question. Justice Brandeis, formerly the late Justice Brandeis of the U.S. Supreme Court,
Very late.
was very late, was fond of saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And following up that thought, I wonder whether either of you or both of you would think that if there had been massive publicity given to the censorship in each of your cases, in your case, the university, in your case, the school would have backed down, embarrassed that in an academic institution they're engaging in censorship. Do you think publicity would have helped or not?
That's a wonderful question. I'm very glad I had the opportunity to answer that. Well, it's interesting that last year, when every one of our posters were torn down, across the board, we couldn't put one up for 3 hours before it being torn down, just as a rule. Nothing was done. No publicity was given to it. The dean did nothing. The Crimson, which is the Harvard newspaper, had made no reference to it at all during the whole course of the year when it was most prevalent. But this year, when the dean was replaced and a few things were done, there was a little bit more attention being paid to it. And the Crimson ran some stories. Now it's a huge issue. I'm here talking to all of you a year and a half after when it was really prevalent, and this is only coming about because of the pressure, because of the influence. People tell me that are pro-choice, that they're sorry that we're being censored, and it's incredible. Now this is taking place after posters being torn down across the board last year when it was most prevalent.
What about in your case, Jeremy? Do you think
I
publicity
have a
has
lot to
hurt
say
or
about
helped
publicity
you?
in the media. Thursday, Friday afternoon, I forget what it was, I was told to stop showing the movie. My boss was on the phone with the paper. And
This was the local paper in Lynn?
This was the local, yeah. And she was on the phone. I'm like, let me talk. She's like, no, don't talk. You can't talk. I'm like, all right. And so I started writing things down. I gave it to her. This is my view. I'm not doing this. I am doing this. And she's like, you can't talk to the paper. I'm like, why not? She's like, you just can't. Just don't do it. I'm like, okay. So I went home and called the paper. And I said, the writer, I said, look, don't run the story. It's a nothing story. I don't want it to reflect negatively on my boss or my boss's boss or my boss's boss's boss or my job. They're my students. If a teacher of my student that I've never met has a problem with my teaching practices, I would love to meet that parent. If someone has a problem, let's talk about it. You can say whatever you want. I would love to say whatever I want. I'm a huge conversationalist. I love talking, and I hope that all my students feel comfortable. So I say, don't run it. She goes, okay, I'll check with my bosses. She goes, talks to her editor. She comes back, we got to run it. I'm like, all right. Seriously? Yeah. I'm like, cover someone who just went off to war from Lynn. She's like, we already did that. She's like, I'm like, all right, well, bury the story. She's like, it's front page.
So you didn't want publicity?
I didn't want publicity.
Is that because you don't have tenure yet? Or
no, this is just because I knew that this would happen. I knew that Friday afternoon I would tell her not to print it. Saturday morning they would print it, and they printed it. Saturday night I knew that WBZ would call me and want an interview. They did. 15 minutes later I turn on the radio. I'm there. Sunday afternoon, WB sent a camera crew to come and videotape me. I got 39 seconds on the news. I got a ticker scroll on, MSNBC, Fox, one of those channels. And I just knew that that's, once it's on AP, people pick up on it because they want to talk about it. They want to know my business. And I didn't know my business because whoever complained about the movie didn't see the movie and didn't talk to me, and I teach their children. I would like to meet them if they.
But I think what I'm hearing and what I understand from what I've read about your story is that in your case, the publicity was not helpful, as Justice Brandeis might have hoped that it would be. That in your case, at least, your superintendent or your principal thought that in the town of Lynn, disciplining you for showing this film, not allowing you to show this film, would actually be the popular thing to do. Is that right? Am I understanding this correctly? Not allowing to show the film would be, but yes, the students did not finish seeing the film. I had a lot of problems with teachers who never met me or had talked to me, coming up and sort of giving me frowns. I got a lot of, coming to my office, let's talk about this, what are you doing? A lot of negativity from it. And my students are like, Mr. McKean, we saw the movie. What's the big deal? I ended up getting a lot of letters of support from people. I ended up on the last bullet point on page 112 of Michael Moore's book, as a female, by the way, showing her classes the movie. So you've had a sex change through all this?
No, you have to wait a few years for that. And
see, words are powerful.
Yeah, and
words are powerful.
And the gist of it is the movie's about the media, how they hype everything, and how they jump on it, and how they're your best friend, and how they know more about your case than you do. They're my students. I see them every day. Other teachers and people that would criticize me and what I do have never seen me do my work and my craft. So I didn't want the media. That wasn't my fight.
Okay, I'm going to do this for the radio since we're talking about the media. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Wendy Kaminer and Harvey Silverglate discussing censorship, left, right, and censor. Let me say that again. Censorship, left, right, and center. I'd like to ask a question first of Harvey and then ask Wendy to follow up on it, taking us away from these particular cases, which I think are interesting, and I could ask a lot of specific questions, but I want to ask a much bigger and more general question. Harvey, you've been involved with censorship and freedom of speech cases for 35 or more years. You started out in 1969. How have the students who are in trouble, whom you are befriending, how have their cases changed over that time? Are there different issues being addressed, more serious issues? Are there more attacks from the left or the right? Is self-censorship a growing problem? Could you just give us a brief summary of your view of the problem that censorship was, is, and is becoming?
First of all, I think contrary to common understanding, the First Amendment was really a pretty dead letter in this country until the First World War, when anti-war protests and particularly the views of anarchists and communists began to throw fear into the authorities. And there was a backlash to the Palmer raids and other assorted free speech atrocities. The ACLU was born just about that time and started to go to court in order to try to breathe some life into the language of the First Amendment.
And the ACLU really grew out of efforts to protect dissenters.
Right,
During
and
World
labor
War I,
organizers.
labor organizers. I mean, this was a period when Eugene Debs was sentenced to a 10-year prison term for making a speech against the draft and against World War I. He was sent to prison for 10 years for that.
And interestingly, some of the most important free speech law that was announced by the Supreme Court grew out of periods of great turbulence. It began after in the aftermath of World War I. There were many cases that came out of that era. The civil rights movement spawned an enormous number of Supreme Court cases about freedom of speech. The protests against the Vietnam War contributed even more. The gradual evolution of American culture, which issues of sex started to be talked about publicly, also produced a series of free speech cases protecting sexually oriented speech and literature. So each era, the problems of each era has produced increasingly broad protections for free speech, coming mostly from the Supreme Court, and this has been imbibed by and large in the culture. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody, or a lot of people don't take the position, well, I believe in free speech, or, I believe in free speech for me, but not for thee. But by and large, there has been an expansion in free speech. There, however, has been a counter-offensive, and it really began on college campuses. It's now fairly widespread, and that's what Wendy was talking about earlier. This culture that says that you have a right not to be offended, an extraordinary notion in a free society. It's the basis of campus speech codes. But the campus speech codes don't say you can't say things that are evil. They don't say that you can't say things that are, in any way dangerous. But what they do say is that you can't say things that are going to offend people in various categories, and sex, gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, and so forth. That is the form that censorship has taken in the last 20 years. It is prevalent in the workplace, where there are sexual harassment, racial harassment codes in the workplace. It is very prevalent on college campuses, where it really started in the mid-1980s. Whenever the cases are taken, these codes are taken to court, we win those cases, but nonetheless, even though the courts have been very good about why these codes are unconstitutional, nonetheless, they are retained on, Harvard, your university, you can say much more right here than you can across the street in Harvard Yard. And that's a remarkable development, because up until the mid-'80s, the universities were freer. They're the freest places in the society. They're now the least free. So we're in an era of a rather odd reallocation of speech rights, and it's very hard to figure out exactly how come it started on the campuses and is still running roughshod over students' and faculty members' rights.
Wendy, do you want to theorize about why this might be happening? And would you also, I know we talked earlier and you said that you didn't think the climate after 9/11 had changed the position of censorship in the society, but I wonder if you would expand on that view a little bit and bring censorship right up to date.
Well, of course, efforts to censor political speech in particular have greatly intensified to a really dangerous degree since 9/11. So I didn't mean to suggest that 9/11 hasn't changed anything, but simply that the tactics of the censors are not at all new. Recently, for example, the governor of Rhode Island tried to resurrect some state laws that were enacted in 1919 during this very repressive World War I period that criminalized advocacy, mere advocacy of anarchy, or criminalized speech that advocated overthrowing the government. Now, there is a line of Supreme Court cases that say that you can't prohibit mere advocacy, that there has to be some, in order to criminalize speech, there has to be a very, very, very close connection between the speech and some criminal acts, so that, you know, I can't say to Harvey, go beat up that guy across the street. That in itself is like an attempted assault. But I can say to Harvey, don't you think it would be a great thing if we could overturn the current regime in this country? Nobody can or should be able to send me to prison for that, though these days you never know. I want to disagree a little bit with something that Harvey said. You know, he's absolutely right that censorship on campuses has really greatly intensified in the last 10 or 15 years. There's been a great diminution, not just of speech rights, but of due process rights on campus, and Harvey's been deeply involved in fighting this for a long time. But I think it is hyperbole to say that there's more freedom off campus than there is on campus, particularly when you look at the Patriot Act, at various counterterrorism laws. There are greater and greater restrictions on freedom of association. If you look at the definition of domestic terrorism in the Patriot Act, it's very broad and vague, as many civil libertarians have pointed out, and it could be applied to groups like Greenpeace, to groups that are engaged in civil disobedience, to protest actions in which, you know, somebody upends a garbage can or throws it through a window. It's this dangerously broad definition of domestic terrorism. There are dangerously broad laws against supporting organizations that are deemed terrorists by somebody in the administration. So, you know, we really are in a very frightening way going back to the future in terms of the way we treat political dissent. Now, in many ways, that's not surprising. Civil liberties always suffer greatly during wartime, and whether it's a war on terror or a war on drugs or a war on crime, that also always translates into a war on liberty. So it's not surprising that we're seeing the kind of repression today that we are.
I'll add this to what Wendy said. One of the ways, the most pernicious ways that the Patriot Act has affected free speech has been this. The Department of Justice has taken the position in a lot of cases that, for example, somebody found possessing videotapes of fiery sermons by Muslim clerics demonstrates that they are, quote, associated with terror or terrorists. That kind of evidence, which previously would be inadmissible, they can't go through my library, find a copy of Mein Kampf, which, by the way, is in my library, and say I'm a Nazi. But now it is actually being done. This is used as evidence that somebody is, quote, sympathetic to, associated with terrorism. And things that you say, suddenly you have to watch what you say, because there's a very broad definition now the Department of Justice goes by for giving support to terrorists.
And there have been some very serious crackdowns on political demonstrations. There was an anti-war demonstration in Washington a year or so ago, during which the police herded protesters and stupidly caught up a few journalists in their sweep. They herded them into a confined area and then arrested them. It was completely illegal. I spoke to a student who had been arrested in either an anti-war or an anti-globalization protest in Pennsylvania about a year or two ago, and he told me that the police in his case, he was involved in a peaceful demonstration, but the police in his case justified his arrest by calling it a preemptive arrest. And he said to me, why did they even wait for me to leave my apartment? You know, if they're arresting me preemptively, why don't they just come and get me? So we live in interesting and dangerous times.
Well, there have been places when the police did just come and get you, and you didn't necessarily come back afterwards. In this country, with arrests of immigrants and undocumented aliens. So it could happen, I guess.
Well, it has happened. I mean, after 9/11, we had at least some 1,200 people, mainly immigrants, swept up. people who had no apparent connection to terrorism, who were kept in prison for extended periods of time without being charged, without being allowed to see attorneys. To this day, we don't even know exactly how many or who these people were. Supposedly about half of them were deported and about half of them were released, and I think none of them were ever charged in connection with terrorism. We have the president who's given himself the authority to designate virtually anybody he wants to designate an enemy combatant and hold them without, try them in a military tribunal without all the normal and necessary procedures that ensure some fairness. So in some ways, it is happening. It's mostly happening to immigrants. If it starts to happen to people on a broader scale, and if it starts to happen to people with whom the average American, whoever the average American is, identifies with, then I think we will start seeing more and more protests. Though we have seen a growing grassroots movement against the Patriot Act. We've seen a lot of towns and communities passing these resolutions against the Patriot Act. But I see people standing up, and I hope we can begin to open this up to the audience. Much as I hate to cut off my friend Harvey Silverglate.
Interesting, though, to me, is that much of the protest against the Patriot Act comes from the campuses. And it's so interesting to me that while they are protesting these incursions of liberty by the government, they are censoring groups like Dan's group. You really have to have a split mind to be able to do that. And yet college administrators do it with great ease. It's quite amazing.
Can I say
Well,
something really quickly before,
yes,
before
Dan.
we open up the questions?
I think there's a very clear analogy. Last year, it was called the Bi, Gay, Lesbian, and Transgendered Student Association. Buglitza is the acronym. They had 2 of their posters torn down from the doors in the room of the dorm. And the undergraduate council, the Harvard student body, held a special meeting where everyone rallied to the cause, a packed room, 200 people, where they allocated $700 towards a tolerance fund at Harvard for the homosexual community, which was being put under the heel of intolerant students. At Harvard College, this was deemed a major problem. So this $700 was set aside for any student group, and it was twice the amount of money any particular student group received. This $700 was set aside for any event which promoted toleration of homosexuals at Harvard. Clearly not a problem when the only documented instance of alleged intoleration was 2 posters being torn down from the door. And while this was going on, nothing was said about Harvard Right to Life or any conservative group at Harvard, which is the real object of intoleration. It's a clear dichotomy in the interests of the liberal interests at Harvard.
Okay, you've been listening to Wendy Kaminer and Harvey Silverglate discussing censorship, left, right, and center. The floor is now open for your questions.
I have the impression that some organizations or corporations have been successfully sued by people who were offended by statements made by employees or members of those organizations. If that's true, and I'm interested if it is true, do corporations have the right to have a speech code to limit what their employees can say so that they can remain free of being sued, or should there be a law that prohibits offended people from suing the corporation for statements made by individual members of a corporation?
Well, I think what you're referring to are sexual harassment codes,
Yes.
wouldn't you say, Harvey? Sexual harassment codes that prohibit...
and racial harassment codes.
And right, sexual or racial harassment codes, or harassment codes, periods, that prohibit abusive speech, which is variously defined. And those cases are quite controversial. There are Supreme Court rulings that say that creating a hostile environment can be an actionable form of harassment, and there's a lot of debate over whether and to what extent hateful speech, whatever is deemed hateful speech, can be a hostile environment. I am very leery of those cases. I am very leery of regulating even what some might consider abusive speech unless it is really clearly, intentionally abusive, very clearly targeted at an individual. It makes me very nervous when putting a poster up in your cubicle is considered a form of harassment or abuse.
But there's an aspect of your question, though, that hasn't been answered. You asked if companies can do this. Private companies can have the power to establish civility codes within the workplace. There's no question about that.
And a university presumably could do it too.
A private university could do it too. But of course, a company doesn't have a tradition of academic freedom. A university does. That's a huge difference. But aside from that, the private workplace, you can have these codes. The problem that we face today is that the government is forcing companies to adopt so-called sexual or racial harassment codes, which have, and employees, rather than be sued for violation of federal regulations with discrimination in the workplace, they have gone overboard in restricting speech. And so today the workplace is almost as unfree as the campus.
So would you endorse a policy that you can't sue the corporation for an act of an individual employee, or that it becomes a criminal act that the employee is responsible for? Well, what's the alternative?
The fact is, it doesn't matter what I think. The fact is you can sue a company if you can show that the company has allowed this speech to fester and offend you, harass you, so to speak. And many workplaces, there are more lawyers now who advise companies on what employees should not be allowed to say. I mean, lawyers are just multiplying like vermin in the...
But I think
so why not come up with an alternative like I'm proposing?
I don't think there's a simple yes or no answer to the question that you're asking. Should you be allowed to ever sue a corporation for the action of one of its employees? You know, depending on the facts, sometimes you should and sometimes you shouldn't. I don't think we can make a hard and fast rule about that.
Hi. My question is about either of you commenting on the right and left media in regard to two instances, one in which Senator John Kerry suggested there should be a regime change in Washington. And then secondly, recently, W said the National Education Association is a terrorist organization.
Right. I think that was the Secretary of Education.
Right.
Secretary, sorry.
Yeah.
Exactly. Perhaps you can comment.
I'm not sure.
The question is.
Well,
I'm not sure where your question is.
The question is about the news, the media picking up on one thing versus the other.
Well, the media picked up on Secretary Page's remarks because it was quite inflammatory, and the teachers got very, very angry at him. And, in fact, he's had to apologize for it several times. You know, the media picking up on John Kerry's remark about regime change, I don't find that terribly remarkable. I don't even find that an indication that the media has a right-wing bias, though I think in many ways the media does have a right-wing bias. I think that's just business as usual. I mean, that was a controversial remark, and it was considered newsworthy, and it would get people interested. It's a little bit like asking why they cover the Lacey Peterson case.
I actually disagree a bit. I think that it is indicative of a deeper problem, because when Kerry said that, regime change, a lot of the commentary was, well, he's comparing our president with Saddam Hussein. This is political hate speech. This is dangerous. That's the kind of, and also a lot of the listservs were flooded with this kind of nonsense. But it's all part of this oversensitivity that we have to, for example, metaphor. And you try to engage in parody today. People take it literally. We are losing the ability to tell the difference between parody and reality because we have
That's
such a
because there isn't that much of a
hypersensitivity.
difference between parody
Well,
and reality.
maybe
anymore.
that's the era that we're cursed to live in.
But
Who
but
knows?
but I think Harvey is right to point out the way, and I've heard this, I think, from Ed Gillespie. What is he? Is he chair of the RNC?
Republican National Committee.
Yeah, he's chair of the RNC, who's been talking about the Democrats engaging in political hate speech. And I think that people on the left should learn from that. They should learn that all of their rhetoric and all of their ideas about censorship are being turned against them. They were it was years ago, some years ago, you could listen to Jerry Falwell and Phyllis Schlafly talking about pornography in some of the same ways that people like Catherine McKinnon were talking about pornography. This is an old story, whether they come from the right or whether they come from the left. Censors almost always try to justify their efforts to suppress speech by talking about how dangerous or how hateful the speech is.
Thank
you. I have cataracts in both eyes, and my favorite reading matter is on Harvard bulletin boards. So at least once a week I will temporarily remove a poster so I can read the small print. I obviously had better be very careful of. I won't touch any of Dan's posters.
You're the only one who won't, so
Right.
Thank you.
So my two very simple questions. Has Dan's group been putting up posters? Is there any more problem with posters? I mean, there must be well over 100 bulletin boards in this university, and to police them would be a rather difficult task. My first question is Dan or any other group having a serious problem with posters being torn down this year? My second question, as a passionate centrist, my favorite think tanks are the New America Foundation or the Progressive Policy Institute, for example. As a passionate centrist, the advertising for this seminar said that we would be told about censorship by the center. I'd appreciate some being cited.
Well, let's take
first,
the first.
Let's let Dan answer the first
Yeah,
question
let's take the first
about.
question, Dan.
I'll be quick. It's definitely the case. Just a few days ago, a freshman, a first year at the college, wrote to the dean this year again, citing that in 5 or 6 days, 14 posters were torn down from one entryway in one of the dormitories. And in another few different areas, they were torn down before the day was over, before putting it up. And it was interesting, the response that he received from the dean, which I found incredible. The dean said that, you know what, some of the janitors, they like to take down the posters early, so this might be responsible for the 14 posters being taken down in a few days. And she recommended to him that if we're having problems with postering in the houses, in acknowledged places where student groups are allowed to poster, then we should find another venue. That was her solution to this problem, which was incredible. And to answer the second part of your question, it's very much an issue. And there's, give or take, 350 areas at Harvard where we can poster. There's one area in each of the entryways to the houses. So there's quite a number.
And I think to answer the second part of your question about censorship from the center, if you want to learn something, to understand something about public attitudes towards free speech and the First Amendment, I would strongly recommend that you go to the website of the Freedom Forum and take a look at their annual surveys on the state of the First Amendment. And if you are a civil libertarian who cares about free speech, this is going to be a pretty depressing exercise, because you'll find you'll find fairly strong support. I mean, either plurality support or majority support for prohibiting racist speech, for prohibiting desecration of the flag, for prohibiting criticism of the government during wartime. I mean, you'll find that support for various forms of censorship is surprisingly strong. When people are asked a general question, do you support free speech, a strong majority will say yes. But then when you break it down, should an atheist be allowed to speak in town hall? Should the press be able to criticize the government during wartime? You'll find that the support gets weaker and weaker and weaker. For, I think, a more concrete example of censorship from the center, I think one of the best places to look probably is at the popularity of efforts to somehow regulate sex or violence in the media. Joe Lieberman, who I think is probably a prime example of a centrist. I remember a couple of years ago maybe this is when he was running for vice president in 2000, was talking a lot about regulating the ways in which movies are marketed. Isn't that right, Harvey? Do you remember that? But you can.
Yes. He wanted more labels.
He wanted more labels, and you'll find a lot of centrist politicians.
But I don't think
supporting those kinds of measures. Just look at what Congress has done in the last several years in terms of trying to regulate whatever they call indecency on the internet. I think those are centrist proposals that are probably supported by strong pluralities, if not a majority of the American public.
I have a different view on how to answer the question, because I consider the censorship of sexually oriented material to be largely censorship from the right, especially the cultural conservative right.
I disagree with that completely, Harvey. I mean, look at the feminist movement against pornography. That really fuels
the kind of feminist, the radical feminists who are really with the censors on the right, the anti-pornography movement. But I have a different set of examples. I think that censorship from the right and left is largely political and cultural. Censorship from the center is largely composed of administrators and politicians, people in positions of power who don't want to be criticized. It has nothing to do with right or left. There was a very interesting example a year or two ago at the Harvard Business School in which the editors of the Harvard Business Review were called on the carpet by administrators at the business school because they criticized members of the administration for not being able to run the website right. And they were actually called in to an administrator's office and threatened, and one of them resigned. The editor of the paper resigned. Now that, you can't put a political label on that, but what it is I'm an administrator, I have power, I'm entitled not to be criticized, you're out. That's what, to me, censorship from the center is all about.
Harvey, that's true on college campuses, and that's true in bureaucracies in general, but I think that is not true if you look at public support for various efforts to censor what goes on in the media, to censor some political demonstrations. The support for that doesn't just come from people, further along on the right or further along on the left. The support for that also comes from the center. These are popular measures. I mean, I think the Communications Decency Act, for example, which tried to prohibit indecency on the internet, was a fairly popular measure, and it wasn't just popular among bureaucrats and administrators.
But I can tell you, if the Supreme Court divides on that case, which I think it will, you'll find generally there'll be a couple of liberal justices who will be against the act, and the conservative justices will probably be in favor.
The court struck that case down, but I don't struck that law down.
The oral argument this time didn't sound
that was
so
the Communications Decency Act. That's a different law that you're talking about now. But I think that there is general public support for those laws.
Let's go on with the next question.
Well, a comment first. I just wanted to say that the first newscaster in history, Dimodocus, 2004, 800 years ago, was also the first newscaster to be censored. That is, while he was hiding under a sheepskin, and Odysseus and Telemachus and the old father were slaughtering 117 unarmed people because they'd locked their arms in the arms room.
118.
Did I miss one? And you would tell me in public. They said, Odysseus said to Demodocus, look, we'll let you stay alive on condition that you tell the story, my story, Odysseus, the slaughter and everything else, and the war, the way we want you to. So Demodocus made a very quick decision. He got himself a pen name, Homer, which means hostage, to let everybody know that what they were reading was written by a hostage to the ruling powers. And then he put in all sorts of little tricky ways of getting the real truth through, which you can find out by reading the two stories. That was just a comment.
Thank you.
Now, I have a very awkward question, I'm afraid. I have never done this before, but when I joined the queue, I did see a person sitting near me take a small cardboard box out from behind him and sprinkle it on the floor or near my luggage, then put it back behind him between his shirt and a jacket. I'm very concerned that something might have got accidentally into my luggage. Could I see the contents of that box? Voluntary.
I think we can do this away from the microphone. Let's
Thank you.
go on with the questions.
Yeah, there was recently an article about a survey done at Duke University of self-reported political affiliations of professors in a few of the departments. And it was overwhelmingly Democrat. I think there was absolutely no Republicans. There might have been one, someone identified as an independent. People took this and wrote about it as saying this is an example of the chilling effect that you have in higher education when you have the entire faculty and oftentimes administration who self-identify themselves as liberal or Democrat. And I was wondering if Dan specifically or any of the other panelists had personal experience with this concept of a chilling effect and how they feel that affects censorship in the general education community.
Well, what do you think about it? Do you have an opinion about that? Do you think there's a chilling effect to that?
I think there is probably some level of a chilling effect. I mean, I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories of conservatives, either faculty or students, who are exposed to very liberal or very politically charged speech in class, not like in a political science class, in, for example, a mathematics professor going off against George Bush's policy for Iraq, for example. And I think that it does create some level of self-censorship. I mean, I know as a student, I would never do anything that I think would offend the professor because it's just not worth it to me because I want to make sure I get an A in the class. So I think that there is going to be some level of self-censorship if you know a professor or a dean has a certain bias or has a certain way of viewing the world which doesn't necessarily agree with you. And when you're dealing with someone who's in power.
Sure. I'd like to hear you talk about that as a student, and I'd like to hear Jeremy comment on that as a teacher.
About 2 weeks ago, I went to my physics professor to ask for a recommendation for medical school and talking about some of the things I was involved in. This is a physics professor, science. I didn't stop to consider political views. And I mentioning some of the things I was involved in. I said, oh, by the way, I'm also the president of Harvard Right to Life. She paused for a second and said, oh, is that the anti-choice group on campus? I said, oh, well, yeah, well, it is. And she said, oh, well, what else do you do besides making life more difficult for women? And it just took me aback. I don't know if I'm going to use her recommendation now. I'm not allowed to see the recommendation. I have to just choose it on a whim and hope that it's a good one. It's ridiculous. Today, in one of my classes, I had mentioned that I was in favor of George Bush being reelected. Don't get angry. But so this woman said, oh, you shouldn't have told me that, jokingly. You shouldn't have told me that. Now I'm going to have to grade the papers anonymously. And these are all jokes. They say it laughingly. But underneath that, there's an underlying current within the administration, especially at Harvard, but in most of the universities in the U.S., of a liberal bias. If I mention even that I'm pro-life, let alone that I care about it enough to be the president at a school like Harvard, it's unthinkable. I can't do that. I'm seriously scared I'll get a lower grade in a class. And I don't think that's a slight consideration. I think it's real, let alone for my recommendation. And it seems like there's a liberal tyranny in the administration of universities. And I don't use the word tyranny lightly. It's definitely true. A professor cannot receive tenure if his conservative views become revealed. My roommate's father is a professor at Clark University and a very conservative man. There's not a chance, even though he's incredibly well, has various books and a distinguished career, for him as a conservative to be appointed at Harvard is nearly impossible. There's not a chance. There isn't room for conservatives or even differing viewpoints to get a foothold in the higher academic establishment. And I think that's awful.
And, of course, there are big segments of the political establishment where exactly the opposite is true. So it's there's this remarkable dichotomy between academia and other parts of the country, but nonetheless what they have in common is intolerance for dissenting views.
Jeremy, I'd like to hear you comment on how you approach this issue as a teacher. To what extent do you censor yourself in expressing your own political views? Are you conscious of not intimidating students who might feel differently about things than you do?
As an English teacher, I can get away with a lot of things that a math teacher or science teacher wouldn't get away with as far as themes having to do. I mean, I showed the ending of Romeo and Juliet today, in which a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, after getting married, killed themselves. And I showed that in class, and that was 1968 film. I'll show the 1996 film next week. And I also teach, I teach English literature, and I think I just want to say real quickly, it's a shame when academians and intelligent people can't see past their own ideologies. They can't see past their own personal bias. I would never. I feel out my students, if they're comfortable in the class, where they should sit, how they respond. I think it's foolish for someone who values knowledge to say something like that. I joke with my students, but that's after I build a rapport, after they know that I'm joking. What I did want to say about, I forget what it was, but it was the last conversation of many conversations I had behind closed doors. My school last year has a JROTC program, and they can't practice outside in the winter, or in the spring they couldn't. And so I just, berated by one of my uppers, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why are you reveling in this? And so I just kind of walked out of the office, and I just shown Bowling for Columbine, which is about, obviously, the Columbine shootings, guns in high school, and the JROTC in their uniforms marching down the hallway with their guns in line, walked right past me. And I was, just, wow. This is, that's the climate, Yeah. And I can get away with being, out there, eccentric English teacher, goofy here, corny here, whatever. But I would not, I don't tell my kids my opinions unless they absolutely beg.
I think it's a hard problem for teachers, because even if you don't make a point of telling your students your opinions, your students are going to get a sense of where you are politically, and it's your job as a teacher to create an open environment in the classroom and to give them the confidence that you're not going to hold their political views against them, and that every classroom is a free speech zone. I think that's a challenge for people on the right and the left. And as I was listening to Dan, that to me is not a story about ideology. That's a story about really bad teaching. And while it's true that in some colleges and universities the liberals tend to hold power, it is also true that in some colleges and universities some liberals, and especially people who are very opposed to the war or very opposed to the Bush administration, are finding themselves the targets of censorship, are fearful of their own political futures. So, as Harvey has said, there is great intolerance on both the left and the right often for dissenting views.
Now, in the interests of time, we'll take these last, but there are four questions, but let's have pointed, quick questions. And
the radio and TV stations and the movie studios are in very few corporation hands. You see more censorship because of that?
More censorship?
More censorship.
I think it's one of the hardest problems that faces advocates of free speech today is how to deal with the problem of de facto censorship of the marketplace. What do we do about media conglomeration? Private corporations have their own First Amendment rights, which they loudly and vigorously defend. And yet, at the same time, the larger these corporations become and the more centralized the media becomes, the more it functions almost like the government in terms of its control of speech. It's a very hard problem. I don't know exactly what the answer is, except maybe trying to get at it through antitrust laws, but it is a really difficult problem that I don't think First Amendment advocates have a good answer to yet.
And I will just put it a little differently. Censorship is one way of diminishing the variety of views that are available for the public, but another way of diminishing those views is to have a decreasing number of owners of media outlets. It's not exactly censorship, but it also does not promote a variety of views.
Yes, I'd just like to pursue the issue of free speech in the classroom, especially in the elementary level. I teach kindergarten through third grade. And I'm wondering what degree of, like if I was to have a totally free speech classroom and people use racial epithets toward each other, or, I was to talk down about some of the students because of their racial background or their ethnic background and stuff like that. And just in terms of how far does that go, when you're really talking about impressionable children.
Okay, you've asked the question to which, at last, there is actually a clear answer. I'm glad we got one today to which there's a clear answer. And the clear answer is this. The availability of free speech rights varies inversely with age. That is to say, there is much more control that teachers can exert and are expected to exert, kindergarten, first, second, third. The older a student gets, the more academic freedom and free speech rights begin to kick in. It is still a little bit in the gray area in high school level. Once you get to college, you're an adult in the eyes of the law, and free speech and academic rights kick in 100%. So at the lower levels you're discussing, we are able to, I hate to use the word brainwash, I think civilize is probably a better word, to civilize the kids and let them know the difference between what we view as right and wrong. But by the time they get to college, it's a different story. And if you treat college kids like kindergarten kids, you're charging too much tuition.
And they'll probably start acting like kindergarten kids, too.
The next question.
Isn't this forum itself an example of repression or censorship? There is no one here like, for instance, Robert Bork, who wrote an article on the Patriot Act and commentary about a few months ago, and Heather McDonald, who had an article on the same subject in City Journal. There's no one representing that point of view. There's no one on this panel who like Samuel Francis or someone like that representing the paleoconservative right, who could speak eloquently on the repression and censorship that is involved in the racial issue.
But we're not doing anything.
Exactly.
Well, first of all, I doubt very much that Robert Bork would want to be here, would have accepted an invitation to be here. We are not doing anything to limit Robert Bork's right to speak, nor would we want to. He has plenty of forums. He doesn't need and probably wouldn't want this. We have, you have to let writers and people who put together panels choose their subjects. We chose a subject, and our subject here was censorship and the dynamic of censorship from the right and left. We didn't choose to have a debate about the pros and cons of censorship. What we're doing tonight is advocacy, and I don't think advocacy can be called a form of censorship. I think it would be good for the Cambridge Forum when they look at what their programs are, say, over the course of a year, to try to have programs that represent a very diverse point of view. And maybe it would be interesting for Pat to organize another forum where people would talk about the values and the virtues of censorship. But I think it's really a misuse of the word censorship to suggest that by not having Robert Bork or somebody representing that point of view here tonight, we are engaged in a form of censorship.
Yeah, this panel is organized on the assumption that free speech is a good thing, and the question is, how come there is so much censorship from both ends of the political spectrum? Robert Bork would not buy into that assumption, I can assure you.
No, neither do I. I think you're mistaken about that. Also, that I think there was something. I'll just make one more point, if I may. I think there's something disingenuous about the way the problem in the Patriot Act, the question of these very broad definitions of what could be problematical speech. That there is a lot of sentiment. To put it in a proper context, there is a lot of sentiment on the left liberal side that wants to see the United States defeated by external enemies, more than one. There is a lot of sentiment that wants this, to see Western countries defeated and humbled and basically destroyed. So I think you ought to put it in that kind of a context.
All right. And our last question.
Hi, this is specifically to the Harvard undergraduate, but you all might have something to say about this. His name is Dan. Dan, I'm sorry. Relative to the tyranny of which I have no doubt believing that is the case against conservatives at Harvard and other universities of that ilk, I have to wonder to what extent these type of issues could be taken up with the Board of Trustees or a body of people over the faculty, because Harvard is not only a university but a corporation as well, and there are, just as the faculty might have some measure of control over the student body, I think there are a group of people that in some measure have control over these faculty. So I wonder why groups like yours haven't considered sort of addressing these sorts of concerns to these men or women who are on such a board as that, and who I can't believe are impervious to these sorts of concerns.
Well, it's a large toll, but
I'd like to take Dan off the hook for a minute and turn this over to
Yeah.
Harvey, because
I've
Harvey
done
is.
that.
Harvey and his organization, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, have done just that.
One of the most interesting things about boards of trustees of universities is they know almost nothing about what's going on the campus. And the reason for that is that the agendas are prepared by the college and university administrations. And believe me, the issue of why don't we have more free speech on this campus is not on any agenda given to a board of trustees. Now, I had an interesting experience with I co-founded, as Wendy points out, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is a nonpartisan organization fighting for free speech and due process on college campuses. And a couple of years ago, I think 3 years ago, Columbia University adopted a terribly unfair sexual harassment and sexual misconduct policy, which had terrible speech implications as well as due process fairness implications. And we were unable to get anybody in the administration even talk to us about it. I showed up to debate people at the university who were in favor of this code, and an hour before the debate started, members of the administration convinced faculty members to back out. So I was up there without any opposition. What we finally did was we wrote a long letter to the Board of Trustees and mailed it or delivered it to their home addresses. And there was an explosion in Morningside Heights. And lo and behold, the university put the code on hold while it, quote, studied the matter more deeply. What obviously happened was members of the board who had no idea what was going on in Columbia suddenly realized that this horror show was being perpetrated on academic freedom and free speech. They said something and they accomplished something. So I would say to you that one of the things you should do is you should contact both the Board of Overseers and the dreaded corporation, which is really the group that runs Harvard, and let them know what's going on. They don't know what's going on, believe me.
I would think many of these men would be impervious to...
There are a few women on that,
or women,
too. Yeah.
I should say. They're not part of this contemporary political climate, I'm guessing. These people have been out of college for some years, and they might be amazed to learn the contemporary scene of what goes on in academia. So.
I agree with you.
On that note, thank you, Harvey Silverglate. Thank you, Wendy Kaminer. Thank you, Dan Tapia, and thank you, Jeremy Keene, for coming and sharing your experiences tonight.